This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The courtroom smelled of varnish and fear. Theodora Marquis sat with her spine straight and her hands folded on the table in front of her, the way her mother had taught her to sit at funerals, still, composed, unreadable. She wore no jewellery except a thin gold chain tucked beneath her blouse, hidden from the eyes of the prosecutor, the jury, and the cameras banked at the back of the room, like vultures waiting for a body to stop twitching. She was 34 years old. 6 months ago, she had been the youngest chief forensic pathologist in the history of the regional coroner's office, a woman who had built her entire life on the conviction that the dead deserved the truth, even when the living did not want to hear it. Now she was the woman the prosecution called complicit, corrupted, a doctor who sold her oath for a criminal's bed. "Dr. Marquis," the prosecutor said, rising slowly, letting his shoes click against the marble floor like a countdown. "Isn't it true that you altered the toxicology report in the case of Elena Conti to conceal evidence that would have implicated Cesare Vitale in her murder?" The room held its breath. Theodora felt it, that collective inhale, 300 lungs waiting to see if she would break. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the jury. She let her gaze drift, just once, to the man seated behind the defence table 2 rows back. Not a defendant today, only a spectator, because his lawyers were good and hers were better, and neither of them was currently on trial for the thing that actually mattered. Cesare Vitale sat with his hands loosely clasped, his dark suit cut like a blade, his face a study in absolute stillness. Only his eyes moved, only his eyes ever gave him away, and only to her. "Don't," his eyes said, "don't do this for me." She had stopped listening to that warning 6 months ago. "I altered nothing that wasn't already false," Theodora said, and her voice did not shake, though her heart was trying to climb out of her throat. "I corrected a report built on evidence I have since proven was fabricated." A murmur went through the gallery. The judge struck his gavel once, a dry crack like a bone snapping. "You corrected it," the prosecutor repeated, savouring the word like it was rotten fruit. "By removing a blood panel that showed the victim had been poisoned with a compound traced to a supplier used exclusively by the Vitale family. By removing a blood panel that was drawn from a corpse that was not, in fact, Elena Conti." The courtroom exploded. The judge's gavel came down twice, 3 times, useless against the noise. Reporters were already typing, already whispering into phones tucked against their collarbones. Theodora watched the prosecutor's composure crack for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine surprise, because that particular sentence had not been in any deposition, had not been leaked to any paper, had been sitting in her chest like a stone for half a year, waiting for exactly this moment to be dropped into the record where it could never again be buried. Not Elena Conti, because Elena Conti was alive. Because the entire case, the murder, the trial, the 6 months that had taken Theodora's career, her reputation, and very nearly her life, had never been about justice at all. It had been a trap. A beautifully constructed, meticulously staged trap, built not to catch a killer, but to remove an heir from a war of succession that had been simmering under the polished floors of the Vitale Empire for years before Theodora had ever heard the family's name. She had not known that in the beginning. In the beginning, she had believed, truly, professionally, with the full weight of her training and her conscience, that Cesare Vitale was a monster. A man who collected enemies the way other men collected watches, who was rumoured to have ended 3 lives with his own hands and ordered a dozen more, who had looked at her across an interrogation room table with eyes so calm and so cold that she had felt, for one unprofessional moment, that she was looking at something that had never once in its life needed to raise its voice to get what it wanted. She had been right about the danger. She had been wrong about everything else. "Order!" the judge shouted, and slowly, reluctantly, the room quieted. He turned to Theodora with the particular weariness of a man who has presided over 100 trials and recognizes with dread that this is not going to be one he forgets. "Dr. Markey, you will explain that statement to this court in full, or I will hold you in contempt." Theodora looked one last time at Cesare. He gave her the smallest shake of his head. "Not here. Not like this. Let me carry this instead of you." And she understood, with a tenderness that startled her even now, that he would take the fall for her without a second's hesitation, that he had been trying to take the fall for her since the very first night she'd let him close enough to see what waited beneath the ice. She wasn't going to let him. "I'll explain everything," she said, and folded her hands again, and began at the only place a story like this one could ever truly begin. Not with the murder, not with the trap, but 6 months before, on a night she had told herself was the last mistake she would ever make where he was concerned. She was wrong about that, too. The recess lasted 11 minutes. It felt like 11 years. Theodora sat alone in the small conference room the court had allotted her counsel, staring at the glass of water no one had touched, listening to the muffled roar of reporters camped outside like a tide that refused to recede. Her lawyer, a sharp, tired woman named Renata Bossi, who had taken this case against the express advice of every partner at her firm, sat across from her with a legal pad covered in furious shorthand. "You cannot keep doing that," Renata said. "Every time you get within a sentence of the actual truth, you throw yourself in front of it like it's a bullet meant for him." "It is a bullet meant for him," Theodora said. "I'm just faster than the ones firing it." "You're not bulletproof, Theodora. You're a pathologist who broke the law to protect a man the state considers one of the most dangerous individuals in the country. Sympathy is not a defense strategy." "Then what is my defense strategy?" Renata's mouth thinned. "The truth, all of it, told correctly, in order, so that a jury understands you didn't fall for a killer. You fell for a man who was about to be murdered by his own family, and the only way to save him was to become, on paper, exactly the kind of woman the tabloids already think you are." Theodora closed her eyes. 6 months ago, she would have laughed at the idea that her name would ever appear next to the word tabloid. She had built a life that was, by design, invisible. Early shifts at the morgue, late nights cross-referencing case files, a small apartment with more books than furniture, a mother in Bologna who called every Sunday to ask, with barely concealed hope, whether her daughter had met anyone. Theodora's answer had always been the same, delivered with the patient exasperation of a woman who genuinely believed she didn't need anyone. "I met a body today, Mama. That's about as far as my love life goes." She had not been lying, not really, not until the night everything changed, the night the Elena Conti case landed on her table, and with it the man whose name would come to mean something entirely different to her than it meant to the rest of the world. The door opened. A bailiff informed them recess was over. Theodora rose, smoothed her blazer, and let herself feel, for one private second, the full weight of what she was about to do. There was no clever way to tell this story that made her look innocent. There was no version of the truth in which she had not deliberately and with full knowledge of the consequences broken every oath her profession had ever asked of her. Not for money, not for fear, but because somewhere in the last 6 months she had looked at a man everyone told her was a monster and found, instead, someone who had spent his entire life being the only thing standing between his family and its own worst instincts. She could tell the court that. She doubted they would believe it, not the way it had actually happened, not with the tenderness underneath the danger, not with the specific, terrifying gentleness of a man like Cesare Vitale, learning for the first time in his adult life to want something he could not simply take. But she would try. Because the alternative was letting them believe the story the prosecution wanted them to believe, that she was a woman seduced by money and violence, rather than a woman who had, very slowly and very much against her own judgment, seen a person where everyone else insisted on seeing only a threat. She walked back into the courtroom. Cesare was already seated. He did not look at her this time, a mercy, she understood, because if he looked at her the way he usually did, she would lose the thread of every careful sentence Renata had helped her prepare. "Dr. Markey," the judge said, "you may continue." Theodora took her seat at the witness stand, folded her hands, and let herself go back past the trial, past the arrest, past the moment 6 months ago that she had once believed was the beginning of the end of her career, and was instead, though she hadn't known it yet, the beginning of everything else. "It started," she said, "on the last night I still believed he was guilty." Anselmi's warning stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit. She thought of the day, years earlier, when she'd first walked into the morgue as a junior examiner, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, promising herself she would never let ambition or fear talk her into signing something she hadn't personally verified. She had kept that promise for 14 years. She was about to break every other promise she'd ever made instead, and some small, honest part of her understood that the two things, the promise she'd kept and the ones she was about to break, were, in the end, the same promise, applied to a truth no one wanted her to find. 6 months earlier. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building Theodora had passed 100 times without ever imagining she'd be invited inside. And even now, standing in the private elevator with her heart slamming against her ribs, she wasn't entirely sure invited was the right word. Cesare Vitale did not extend invitations. He extended expectations, wrapped in enough courtesy that refusing them felt, somehow, more dangerous than accepting. "Come to the penthouse tonight," the text had read. "I have something you need to see before tomorrow's hearing." She should have said no. She had told herself that in the elevator, in the lobby, in the taxi, in every one of the 4 days since she'd first sat across an interrogation table from him and felt the peculiar vertigo of being studied by someone who gave absolutely nothing away. She was the forensic pathologist assigned to the Elena Conti case. He was her prime suspect. There was no version of this meeting that belonged inside the boundaries of her professional life. And yet here she was, stepping out into a hallway of pale marble and low gold light, because some reckless, curious part of her wanted, more than she wanted to admit, to know what a man like Cesare Vitale kept behind the door of a life no one outside his family had ever been allowed to see. He opened it himself. No bodyguards in the doorway, no assistant hovering with a tray, just Cesare, sleeves rolled to his forearms, top button undone, looking less like the composed predator from the interrogation room and more like a man who had been awake far too many nights in a row. "You came," he said, as if he'd genuinely doubted it. "Against my better judgment. Most good decisions are." He stepped back to let her in. "Wine?" "I'm here in a professional capacity, Mr. Vitale." "You're here at 11 at night, off the record, in a dress you didn't wear to court today." His eyes moved over her once, slow and deliberate, and she felt it like a physical touch. "Professional capacity left the building around the second glass you're about to have." She should have walked out. Instead, she found herself following him into a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered like something spilled and forgotten, and accepting a glass of wine she had absolutely no intention of finishing, and watching him watch her with an intensity that felt less like intimidation and more, unnervingly, like hunger. "You said you had something I needed to see," she said, because if she didn't anchor the conversation to the case, she was afraid of where it might drift instead. Something shifted behind his eyes, not softness exactly, but a kind of grim calculation, a man deciding how much truth he could afford to spend. He crossed to a cabinet, retrieved a folder, and set it on the low table between them without handing it to her. "Everything the prosecution has on me," he said, "was given to them by someone inside my own family. I want you to look at the forensic timeline again, not the summary your office prepared, the raw data. Why would I trust anything you hand me? You wouldn't. That's why I'm not asking you to trust it. I'm asking you to verify it, the way you'd verify anything else, with your own hands, your own instruments, your own conclusions." He sat across from her, close enough that she could smell cedar and something colder underneath it, something like the inside of a locked room. "I didn't kill Elena Conti, Dr. Marchi. I don't expect you to believe me because I said so. I expect you to believe the evidence, once you've actually been allowed to see all of it." Teodora looked down at the folder and felt the first genuine crack in the case she had, until this moment, considered closed in her own mind. She was a scientist. She did not deal in feelings, in charisma, in the unsettling gravity of a dangerous man leaning just slightly too close. She dealt in data. "I'll look at it," she said, "because it's my job to look at everything. Not because I believe you. I know." Something that was almost a smile touched his mouth, gone before it fully arrived. "You don't believe anyone yet. That's fine. I'm patient." She left an hour later, the folder tucked against her chest, like something that might burn her, telling herself the tightness in her chest was suspicion and nothing else. It would be 4 more days before she admitted, even to herself, that it hadn't been suspicion at all. That she had left his penthouse with the very first thread of a doubt that would eventually unravel everything she thought she knew about the case, about him, and about the kind of woman she had always believed herself to be. 1 week before the arrest. The message came at 2 a.m. 3 words long. Don't trust Dario. Teodora read it twice before she understood it wasn't a warning about the case. It was a warning about her. She had met Dario Vitale exactly once, Cesare's uncle, silver-haired and soft-spoken, a man who wore his charm like a well-tailored coat, and who had sat in on precisely one of her interviews with the family's legal team, asking careful, solicitous questions about her methodology, her caseload, whether she was finding the investigation stressful. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Family members hovered around murder investigations the way flies hovered around anything left out too long. It was only now, staring at Cesare's text in the dark of her apartment, that she understood Dario's questions had not been concern. They had been reconnaissance. She called Cesare before she could talk herself out of it. He answered on the first ring, which told her, more than anything he said, that he hadn't been asleep either. "He's been asking about you," Cesare said, without preamble. "Where you live, who you see outside work, whether you have family close by. Why would your uncle care about any of that?" A long pause. When Cesare spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not the cold control of the boardroom, not the practiced charm of the penthouse, but something rawer, something that sounded almost like fear on behalf of someone else. "Because you're becoming a liability to a story he needs to stay closed. And Dario doesn't remove liabilities with lawyers, Teodora. He removes them permanently." Her hand tightened around the phone. "Are you telling me I'm in danger?" "I'm telling you that from this point forward, you don't go anywhere alone. You don't take calls from numbers you don't recognize, and you don't, under any circumstances, tell anyone at your office what you found in that raw data. Not until I know exactly how deep this goes." "That's not how my job works, Cesare. I have an obligation to report." "I know what you're obligated to do." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and it was the first time she'd heard anything in him that sounded like it might actually break. "I also know that the last person in my family who tried to expose Dario's dealings was found in the Tiber 11 years ago, and the coroner's report called it an accidental drowning. I am not going to let that happen to you because you did the right thing at the wrong moment." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything neither of them was saying. Teodora sat on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something in her chest reorganize itself completely. The last of her professional detachment, finally, irreversibly giving way to something far more dangerous. She was not supposed to care whether Cesare Vitale sounded frightened for her. She was not supposed to notice the way his voice changed when he talked about protecting her, as though the idea of her being hurt cost him something he hadn't expected to spend. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked quietly. "What happens to me?" Another pause, longer this time. "I've asked myself that question every day for a week," he said. "I don't have a good answer. I only have the true one, which is that it matters more than it should, more than is safe for either of us, and I don't know how to make that stop." She should have ended the call there. She should have reported the conversation to her supervisor, requested reassignment, put the entire weight of professional distance back between herself and a man who had just, in the space of 10 sentences, confessed to an attachment that violated every rule she had ever lived by. Instead, she said, "Don't stop," and heard him exhale on the other end of the line, like a man finally allowed to breathe. It would be 2 more days before she understood exactly how right Cesare had been to be afraid. Not for himself, but for her. And exactly how far his uncle was willing to go to keep his nephew from ever standing trial and walking free. She thought too about her mother, safely oblivious in Bologna, still asking every Sunday whether her daughter had met anyone, and felt a fresh wave of fear that had nothing to do with herself. If Dario was capable of watching a stranger's family this closely, he was capable of finding her mother's address in an afternoon. She didn't say that fear out loud to Cesare. She didn't have to. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, steadier than she expected. "If anything happens to my mother because of this, it won't," Cesare said, before she could finish the sentence. "I already have someone watching her building. She won't know it. She'll never have to know any of it if I have anything to say about how this ends." It should have alarmed her how easily he'd already anticipated a fear she hadn't voiced yet. Instead, it settled something in her chest that had been tightening for days. 10 days before the arrest. The address Cesare gave her belonged to a farmhouse 2 hours outside the city, tucked into a fold of hills where the cellular signal dropped to a single flickering bar, and the only sound was wind moving through olive trees that had probably stood there longer than the Vitale family itself. Teodora had told her office she was taking personal leave. She had told her mother she was working a difficult case. She had told no one the truth, because the truth, that she was driving into the countryside alone to meet a man her own department had labelled a flight risk, would have ended her career on the spot, and possibly her freedom along with it. Cesare was waiting by the gate when she arrived, and for once he wasn't wearing the armour of a tailored suit, just a dark sweater, jeans, the kind of stillness in his shoulders that told her he'd been standing there for a while, watching the road, waiting to see if she'd actually come. "You didn't tell me where we were going," she said, stepping out of the car. "I couldn't risk it being intercepted." He glanced past her, scanning the empty road out of habit rather than expectation, and then looked back at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the specific, careful way he looked at her whenever he was about to hand her something that mattered. "What you're about to see doesn't leave this property. Not in a report, not in a conversation, not even in your own head once you walk back out that gate, unless you decide, really decide, that you're willing to live with the consequences of knowing it." "That's not how evidence works, Cesare." "I know. That's why I'm asking instead of just showing you." Something in his voice, the restraint of it, the deliberate handing over of a choice he could easily have taken from her, made her nod before she'd fully thought it through. He led her past the farmhouse to a smaller cottage set back among the trees, knocked twice in a pattern that was clearly a signal, and waited. The door opened. A woman stood in the frame, mid-30s, dark-haired, wrapped in a cardigan 2 sizes too large, and Teodora's entire understanding of the last 2 weeks collapsed in the space of a single breath, because she knew that face. She had spent hours studying photographs of that face, cross-referencing dental records against a body burned beyond easy recognition, building a professional certainty around the identity of a corpse that the entire justice system currently believed to this woman. "Elena Conti," Teodora said, and heard her own voice come out flat with shock. "You're the pathologist," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "The one they put on my murder." Theodora's knees felt unsteady enough that she reached for the doorframe. "You're supposed to be dead." "I'm supposed to be a lot of things," Elena said, with the tired, bitter half-smile of a woman who had spent weeks in hiding, rehearsing exactly this conversation. "Dario paid for my silence 11 months ago, when I found out he'd been skimming from the family's shipping contracts and funneling it into an account meant to buy loyalty for his son's rise to the top. He told me if I disappeared quietly, I'd disappear alive. When it became clear Cesare wasn't going to be an easy man to frame for my voluntary disappearance, Dario decided he needed a body instead, so he got one." "Whose?" Theodora's voice had gone very quiet. "A woman who'd overdosed 3 states away. No family, no one who'd ever come looking. Dario's people altered dental records, planted personal effects, made sure the burns were bad enough that a standard identification would rely on exactly the kind of secondary evidence they controlled." Elena's eyes flicked to Cesare, something complicated passing between them. Old history, Theodora understood, but not the kind either of them seemed inclined to explain right now. It was never about killing me. It was about killing him, legally, permanently, in a courtroom where his own family wouldn't have to get their hands dirty. Theodora stood in the doorway of a cottage in the hills, staring at a woman whose murder she had spent 2 weeks building a professional case around, and felt the entire architecture of her certainty come apart at the seams. Every instinct she had trusted, every conclusion she had drawn from evidence she now understood, had been deliberately, expertly falsified. All of it built on a foundation designed by people who had studied exactly how her profession worked well enough to exploit its blind spots. "I need to see everything," she said finally, her voice steadying even as her hands did not. "The account records, the body's real identity, whatever you have." "That's the thing about the truth," Cesare said quietly, watching her with an expression that held equal parts relief and dread, because he understood exactly what she was about to sacrifice by choosing to see it. Once you know it, you can't unknow it. And you can't report it either, not without exposing Eleanor to the exact danger she's been hiding from for a year. Theodora looked at him for a long moment, feeling the full, terrible weight of the choice unfolding in front of her, between the oath she'd sworn to the dead and the truth she now owed to the living, between the career she had built with 15 years of relentless discipline and the man standing in front of her who had just handed her, without hesitation, the one secret capable of destroying him if she chose to use it the way her job required. "Show me everything," she said again, "and then I'll decide what kind of doctor I'm willing to be." 2 weeks before the arrest. It had started 3 days earlier with a single inconsistency so small that any other pathologist might have missed it entirely. Theodora had spent her career learning to distrust convenient stories, and the story the Elena Conti file told was, on its surface, almost too clean. A body burned beyond visual recognition, dental records matching, a partial toxicology screen implicating a compound sourced, according to the investigating detectives, from a supplier with documented ties to the Vitale family's shipping operation. Every piece slotted together with the smooth, satisfying click of a puzzle designed by someone who understood exactly what a jury wanted to hear. That smoothness was what bothered her. She had sat alone in the morgue at 11 at night, 3 days before Cesare ever handed her that first folder, running the dental comparison through a second, independent database instead of the one her office had originally used. A habit she'd developed after a case early in her career had nearly convicted an innocent man on records that turned out to have been transcribed incorrectly by an overworked clerk. The second database returned a partial match, not the clean confirmation her original report claimed. A partial match wasn't proof of anything. It was, however, exactly the kind of loose thread Theodora had built an entire career on pulling. She had requested the original dental x-rays from the archive. They had been, according to the Records Office, temporarily unavailable for digitization. She had requested the chain of custody log for the body's personal effects. 2 signatures on it belonged to officers who, according to department records, had been on leave the week the evidence was logged. None of it was conclusive. All of it was wrong, in the specific, quiet way that made Theodora's skin prickle. The way a body told you it had died differently than the scene suggested. The way a wound pattern didn't match the weapon in evidence. The small, honest inconsistencies that liars, no matter how careful, could never quite smooth away. She had not gone to her supervisor. That was the decision that would matter most, later, when a courtroom asked her to account for every choice she'd made in this case. The moment she chose, instead of escalating her suspicions through the department, to bring them directly to the one person with every reason in the world to want her to stop looking. She had gone to Cesare's legal team, requesting an off-record meeting to discuss procedural irregularities in the case file. She had told herself it was protocol, verifying concerns with defense counsel before formalizing an internal complaint. She had known, even as she told herself that it was already something else. Curiosity, certainly. But underneath the curiosity, something warmer and far more dangerous. She wanted to see him again, and she was disturbed by how much she wanted it, and she had gone anyway. That meeting had led to the penthouse. The penthouse had led to the folder. The folder had led, 10 days later, to a cottage in the hills and a dead woman who wasn't dead at all. But it had started here, in an empty morgue at 11 at night, with a partial dental match and a chain of custody log with 2 names that didn't belong, and a pathologist who had built her entire identity around never letting a convenient story go unquestioned, even when questioning it meant walking directly into the kind of danger she had spent her whole career examining from a clinical, comfortable distance. She thought about that often in the months that followed, how the whole catastrophic, extraordinary unravelling of her old life had begun not with Cesare Vitale's eyes across an interrogation table, not with his voice on the phone at 2 in the morning, but with her own stubborn, professional refusal to accept an answer simply because it was the one everyone wanted her to accept. She had always believed that instinct was her greatest strength. She would spend the rest of this case and the rest of her life afterward trying to decide whether it had also been her undoing. She had thought more than once in the days that followed about calling Dr. Fabrizi, her old mentor, retired now to a small house outside the city, the one person who had taught her everything she knew about refusing convenient answers. She had picked up the phone twice and put it down twice, unable to find the words that wouldn't implicate either of them the moment she said them aloud. Fabrizi had always told her that the dead asked only one thing of the living: to be seen accurately, without flattery or convenience. She wondered, staring at that chain of custody log at midnight, Whether that same rule applied to the living too. Whether Cesare Vitale, guilty or not, deserved to be seen as accurately as she had always insisted the dead deserved to be seen. 3 weeks before the arrest, the first time Cesare touched her, really touched her, not the careful, deniable brush of fingers passing a folder across a table, was in the back of a car speeding away from a restaurant where someone had, 20 minutes earlier, fired 2 shots through the front window, aimed unmistakably at him. Teodora's ears were still ringing. Her hands were shaking so badly she'd had to sit on them to stop the tremor, and Cesare had noticed, of course he noticed everything about her by then, catalogued her the way she catalogued the dead, with total, unnerving attention, and had reached across the seat and taken both her hands in his without asking permission. "You're safe," he said. "I need you to hear me say that and believe it. You're safe. Someone just tried to kill you in front of me. Someone tried to send a message to me using a public place where they knew I'd be careless enough to bring you." His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, Teodora saw something in his expression that wasn't controlled at all. Raw fury, banked low and dangerous, the look of a man recalculating exactly how much blood he was willing to spill to keep something safe. "That was a mistake on my part. It won't happen again." "You're talking about me like I'm an asset that needs better security protocols." "I'm talking about you," he said, low, "like you're the only thing in my life right now I actually can't afford to lose, and I am furious with myself for not understanding that sooner." The car went quiet except for the hum of the engine and her own too fast breathing. He hadn't let go of her hands. She hadn't asked him to. "This is insane," she said, mostly to herself. "I'm the forensic examiner on your case. I'm supposed to be building evidence against you, not sitting in the back of your car while someone shoots at us." "I know exactly what you're supposed to be doing." His thumb moved once, slowly, across her knuckles. Not seductive, not calculated, just the instinctive gesture of a man trying to steady someone he cared about more than he'd meant to. "And I know what I'm supposed to be doing, which is keeping enough distance from you that you can do your job without anyone questioning your objectivity. I've failed spectacularly at that. I'm not currently interested in fixing it." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's an admission." She should have pulled her hands away. She thought about it, genuinely, seriously considered the version of the night where she reclaimed her composure, put the width of the car seat back between them, reminded them both of every professional and legal reason this was a catastrophic idea. Instead, she found herself watching his face in the passing streetlight, the sharp line of his jaw, the specific exhaustion around his eyes that had nothing to do with the gunfire 20 minutes earlier, and everything to do with a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping people at a distance, precisely because letting them close had always, eventually, gotten them killed. "You're not going to lose me," she said quietly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Something moved behind his eyes, relief so profound it looked almost like pain. "Don't promise me that. Not yet. Not until you understand exactly what it will cost you to keep that promise. Then tell me." "I will," he said. "Everything. I owe you that, and more than that, before this goes any further." His hand tightened around hers, deliberate, possessive in a way that should have alarmed her, and instead settled something in her chest she hadn't realized had been unsettled her entire adult life. But not tonight. Tonight, I just need to know you're still here, still breathing, still choosing to be in this car with me, instead of running as fast as your good sense should be telling you to run. My good sense left the building around the same time yours did, she said, and let her fingers curl around his, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the gunshots had, that she had crossed a line tonight she was never going to be able to walk back. Later, long after the car had delivered them safely to his building, she would try to explain this moment to herself in clinical terms: adrenaline, proximity, the well-documented psychological effect of shared danger, accelerating intimacy between two people who might otherwise have taken months to arrive at the same vulnerability. It was a tidy explanation, and it was almost entirely a lie. What she had actually felt, sitting in that car with her hands trembling in his, was something far simpler and far more frightening than adrenaline. The specific, quiet recognition of being genuinely, thoroughly cared for by someone who had every reason in the world to only ever care about his own survival. 4 weeks before the arrest. Teodora had never worn a dress like the one hanging in her closet the night of the Vitale Foundation's annual charity gala. Deep emerald silk, cut with the kind of restrained elegance that cost more than her monthly salary. And she had told herself 3 separate times while getting dressed that attending as Cesare's guest was a professional necessity, an opportunity to observe the family dynamics relevant to her case from the inside. She had stopped believing her own excuses somewhere around the second time she checked her reflection to make sure the dress looked right for him specifically, rather than simply appropriate for the occasion. The ballroom was a study in old money and older secrets. Chandeliers throwing gold light across a room full of people who smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes, every handshake a negotiation, every compliment a small transaction. Cesare moved through it like he owned the air itself, one hand resting at the small of her back, with a possessiveness that drew glances from every direction, and Teodora understood, watching the room watch them, that he had brought her here deliberately, not to hide their connection, but to declare it in front of the one audience that mattered most. Dario found them near the bar an hour in, silver-haired and smiling, his eyes moving over Teodora with a warmth that didn't reach anywhere near sincere. "Dr. Markey," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "What a pleasant surprise. I didn't realize the coroner's office made house calls to charity events." "I didn't realize the case file made comments about my social calendar," Teodora replied, keeping her voice light, though she felt Cesare go very still beside her. Dario laughed, a warm, practiced sound. "Forgive me. I only worry, of course, that a woman with your integrity might find herself in a compromised position, spending so much personal time with my nephew while his case is still active. It wouldn't do, would it, for either of you?" "I appreciate the concern," Teodora said. "I've found the truth tends to survive scrutiny. It's usually only the lies that need protecting." Something flickered behind Dario's eyes, brief, cold, gone before it fully surfaced, and for a moment Teodora saw past the practiced charm to something underneath it that made the hair on her arms rise. Then he smiled again, patted Cesare's shoulder with an affection that looked, now that she knew what to watch for, entirely performed, and excused himself into the crowd. "He knows," Teodora said quietly, once he was out of earshot, "that I'm not just doing my job anymore." He suspected for a while. Cesare's jaw was tight, his eyes tracking his uncle's retreating back with the wary focus of a man watching a predator he could not yet afford to strike. That conversation was a warning, dressed up as small talk. He wants you to know he's watching. He wants me to know it too. Should I be frightened? You should be careful. He turned to face her fully, and for a moment the noise of the gala seemed to recede around them, leaving only the low, urgent honesty in his voice. I built walls around every part of my life for exactly this reason, Theodora, because caring about someone, in my world, is the single most effective way to hand your enemies a weapon. I knew that. I have known it my entire life. And I let you in anyway, because some reckless, selfish part of me decided you were worth the risk to both of us. That's not exactly romantic, Cesare. No, he agreed, and something almost like a smile touched his mouth, dark and honest.
But it's true, and I promised myself I'd never lie to you, not even by omission, not even when the truth makes me sound like the monster everyone already believes I am. She reached up, without entirely deciding to, and rested her palm against his jaw, the first time she had touched him first, deliberately, in front of an entire room of people who would remember it and report it and use it against them both. "You're not a monster," she said. "You're just a man who spent his whole life being told he had to become one." His hand came up to cover hers, holding it there against his face like something he was afraid to lose. "Don't say things like that to me here," he said, low and rough. "Not unless you mean to follow through on them, somewhere I can actually do something about it." She held his gaze, feeling the room, the danger, the entire architecture of a decision she couldn't yet see the full shape of, and said, "Take me home then." He did. 5 weeks before the arrest, his penthouse at midnight looked different than it had the first time she'd stood in it, suspicious and armoured, a doctor cataloguing evidence in a dangerous man's home. Tonight, the city lights below looked less like a battlefield and more like something almost peaceful, and Theodora stood at the window with a glass of wine she had every intention of finishing, listening to Cesare move around the kitchen behind her with the unhurried ease of a man who for once wasn't performing control for anyone's benefit but his own. "You cook," she said, surprised, when he set a plate in front of her that hadn't come from any restaurant. Contrary to popular belief, I wasn't born holding a gun in one hand and a ledger in the other. He sat across from her, sleeves rolled, and for a moment he looked almost unbearably young. Not the cold architect of an empire the newspapers described, but a man who had simply once been a boy who liked to cook because his mother had taught him, and it was one of the only memories of her he still had that didn't hurt to hold on to. "Tell me about her," Theodora said quietly. "Your mother." Something crossed his face, grief so old it had calcified into something almost gentle. "She died when I was 9. Cancer, not the family business, which I think surprised everyone, including her. She used to make me stand on a chair at the counter so I could reach the stove, and she'd let me burn the garlic on purpose the first few times, just so I'd learn what it smelled like when I'd made a mistake, before I ever had to learn it the hard way, with something that mattered more. That's a strange way to teach a child to cook. She wasn't teaching me to cook." His eyes met hers, steady, unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "She was teaching me to pay attention, to notice the moment before something went wrong, instead of only understanding the damage after it happened. I think about that a lot in my line of work. How much of it comes down to noticing the burning garlic before the whole dish is ruined?" "Is that what I am?" she asked, half joking, half not.
A dish you're trying not to ruin? He reached across the table and took her hand, turning it over gently to trace one finger along the lines of her palm, unhurried, deliberate. You're the first thing in 15 years I've been afraid of ruining, he said. Everything else I learned to control. Money, fear, loyalty. All of it responds to the right pressure applied in the right place, if you're patient and precise enough. You don't respond to pressure at all. You respond to truth. And honesty terrifies me more than any rival I've ever had, because I don't know how to be careful with it. I only know how to give you all of it, all at once, and hope you don't run. I'm still here. I've noticed. His thumb traced slow circles against her palm, and the air between them had gone thick with something neither of them was rushing to name. I keep waiting for the morning you wake up and remember exactly what I am, and what world I come from, and decide the risk isn't worth whatever this is turning into. And if that morning doesn't come? Then God help us both, he said, low, rough, because I don't think I know how to let you go anymore. And I stopped being a man who apologizes for what he refuses to give up, a long time before I ever met you. She rose from her chair, crossed the small distance between them, and let him pull her into his lap, with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world believed about him. A man capable of violence, holding her like she was the only fragile thing he'd ever been trusted to carry. His hand came up to cradle the back of her neck, his forehead resting against hers, breathing her in like a man memorizing something he was afraid he wouldn't get to keep. Theodora, he said, her name rough in his throat, equal parts reverence and warning. If you want to leave, this is the moment. Once I close that distance, I'm not going to be able to pretend I can let you walk away untouched by any of this. Not the danger. Not what I am, not what I feel for you, which I have been trying and failing to describe as anything less than obsession for the better part of a month. I'm not leaving, she said, and closed the distance herself. What followed belonged only to them. A slow unmaking of every wall either of them had spent a lifetime building, the city lights burning gold and distant below the window, two people who had both, in their own ways, been taught to survive by keeping everyone else at arm's length, choosing instead, for one night, to hold on. 6 weeks before the arrest. She sat in her supervisor's office 2 days later, staring at a case update form she hadn't yet filled out, and understood with total clarity that she had reached the point in this investigation where continuing forward meant becoming something she had never imagined herself being. Dr. Anselmi, the head of the coroner's office, was a heavy-set man with kind eyes and 30 years of experience reading exactly what a colleague wasn't saying. You've been distracted, Theodora, ever since the Conti case landed on your table. I need to know if that's still a case I can trust you to run objectively. I'm running it exactly as objectively as the evidence allows, Theodora said, which was, she reflected, technically true and completely dishonest at the same time. There are rumours, Anselmi said carefully, that you've been seen with Vitale, outside official capacity. Rumours aren't evidence, Dr. Anselmi. No, he agreed, but they're the kind of thing that gets a case thrown out on appeal and gets a career ended on a technicality that has nothing to do with whether the pathologist in question actually did anything wrong. He studied her for a long moment. I'm not asking as your supervisor right now. I'm asking as someone who watched you build this career from nothing, one 12-hour shift at a time,
because you believed, genuinely believed, that the dead deserved someone who wouldn't cut corners for anyone. Is that still true? Teodora thought about Elena Conti, alive in a farmhouse 2 hours outside the city. She thought about a body that belonged to a nameless woman who had died alone and was now, through no choice of her own, being used as a prop in someone else's murder frame. She thought about the dental records that had gone temporarily unavailable, and the chain of custody log with 2 signatures that didn't belong, and a case built so carefully on convenient lies that anyone without her specific stubbornness would have simply signed off and gone home. "It's still true," she said, "which is exactly why I need another week before I file anything on this case." Anselmi studied her for a long moment, weighing 30 years of instinct against a young pathologist's request. "1 week," he said finally. "And Teodora, whatever's actually going on here, I hope you know what you're risking. Not just your career. Whatever agreement you've made with your own conscience to justify it." She left his office with her hands steady and her stomach in knots, because he had asked, without knowing it, the exact question she had been avoiding since the first night she'd stood in Cesare's penthouse and felt something crack open inside her that she had spent her whole adult life keeping carefully shut. She was no longer investigating whether Cesare Vitale was guilty. She had proof, now, sitting in a hidden folder on an encrypted drive, that he wasn't. That the entire case against him had been engineered from the ground up by his own uncle, a man patient enough to fake a woman's death, meticulous enough to plant false evidence deep enough that only someone as thorough as Teodora would ever have found the cracks. The question she was actually wrestling with, the one she hadn't said out loud to anyone, was whether she was willing to become a criminal herself in order to protect a man who had already, without either of them quite agreeing to it, become the single most important person in her life. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone every Sunday. "Have you met anyone, Cara?" She thought of the particular terrifying honesty in Cesare's eyes the night before, the way he'd told her he didn't know how to let her go. She thought of Eleanor, hiding in a cottage 2 hours outside the city, trusting a stranger with pathology credentials not to get her killed by revealing the truth to the wrong person. There was no version of this that let her be, simultaneously, a woman who followed every rule of her profession and a woman who protected the people she loved. She was going to have to choose. And she understood with the particular clarity that only comes right before an irreversible decision that she had already chosen. Weeks ago, somewhere between a folder handed across a coffee table and a hand closing gently around hers in the back of a car speeding away from gunfire. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. She thought, driving home that night, about the version of herself who had chosen this profession in the first place. 22 years old, freshly graduated, certain that objectivity was a kind of moral purity she could maintain indefinitely if she simply worked hard enough and cared little enough about anything outside the evidence. That version of herself would have been horrified by the woman she'd become in the last 2 weeks. And yet Teodora found, turning the question over and over in the dark of her apartment, that she couldn't summon the horror she thought she was supposed to feel. She felt something closer to clarity, the specific, unsettling clarity of finally admitting a truth she'd been avoiding for reasons that had far less to do with professional ethics than she'd been telling herself. 7 weeks before the arrest. Before there had been trust, there had been strategy,
and Theodora would spend months afterward trying to untangle exactly where one had ended and the other had genuinely, helplessly become something else. The first time Cesare had visited her at the lab, 3 weeks into the investigation, he had come with his lawyer and a court-mandated escort, the whole visit performed for the benefit of the transcript. But he had lingered afterward in the hallway outside the examination room, waiting until the lawyer stepped away to take a call, and had said quietly, "Your work is extraordinary, Dr. Markey. I looked into your record before any of this started. 17 convictions overturned because you refused to sign off on evidence that didn't add up. 14 years and not one documented instance of you cutting a corner for anyone on either side of a case. Is this an attempt to flatter your way into a favourable report? It's an attempt to understand exactly what kind of person I'm dealing with," he'd said, "because I've spent my whole life around people who can be bought, bullied, or bored into looking the other way. You're none of those things. Which means if I want you to see the truth in this case, I can't manipulate you into it. I have to actually earn it."
She had thought at the time that it was simply a clever line, the kind of thing a dangerous, intelligent man said to disarm a woman whose scrutiny threatened him. It had taken her weeks to understand it had also, somehow, been completely sincere. That Cesare Vitale, raised in a world built entirely on leverage and manipulation, had genuinely decided the only way to survive contact with her was to stop performing and start being honest, because anything less would have insulted the one quality about her he'd come to admire more than any other. He had shown up at the lab 3 more times over the following weeks, always with legitimate legal reasons, always lingering a few minutes longer than strictly necessary.
He had sent her once an anonymous bouquet of white peonies with no card, and when she'd mentioned it to him, testing, half suspicious, he hadn't denied it, only said, "I wanted you to have something in your life that wasn't evidence for once." And the simplicity of that had undone her more than any grand gesture could have. He had learned, without her ever telling him, that she took her coffee black and drank it too fast when she was anxious. He had learned that she reorganized her desk compulsively when a case wasn't adding up, and that she hummed old Italian ballads under her breath during autopsies, a habit from her mentor she'd never fully broken. He had learned all of it, not through surveillance. She would ask him later furiously whether he'd had someone watching her, and he had looked genuinely wounded by the question, but through simple, patient attention, the kind of careful noticing his mother had once taught him over a stovetop, applied now to a woman he had decided, somewhere in those first few weeks, he was not willing to lose. "You studied me," she'd accused him once, only half joking, over dinner in his penthouse. "I studied everyone who could destroy me," he'd said. "You were simply the first one I studied who I didn't want to survive without." It was, she understood now, the most honest description he could have given of exactly how dangerous this had become. Not because he had manipulated her into caring for him, though the world would certainly frame it that way once the trial began, but because he had put down, piece by piece, every single weapon he might have used to make her fall for him, and had let her fall for whatever was left underneath instead. It had worked. That was the part the prosecution would never understand, no matter how many times Theodora tried to explain it on the stand. She hadn't been seduced by power or money or the dark thrill of proximity to danger. She had been seduced by the terrifying, unfamiliar experience of being truly, completely known by someone, and choosing, with her eyes fully open, to know him back. There had been a night, early on, when he'd shown up at her building unannounced. No lawyers, no pretext, simply stood on the sidewalk below her window until she came down to ask what he thought he was doing.
I don't have a reason,
He'd admitted, hands in his pockets, looking younger and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. I told myself I'd drive past and not stop. I've been sitting out here for 40 minutes instead. It should have terrified her, the idea of a man like Cesare Vitali losing that kind of control over his own decisions. Instead, she had found herself oddly moved by it, by the evidence that underneath all his careful strategy, there was a man genuinely, helplessly drawn to her, in a way he hadn't planned for and didn't entirely know how to manage. 8 weeks before the arrest, the beginning of the case, the first time Teodora saw Cesare Vitali in person, he was seated across an interrogation table with his hands folded, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked considerably more nervous than he did.
and she remembered thinking, with the detached, clinical assessment she brought to every crime scene, that she had never seen anyone look quite so calm while being accused of murder.
Dr. Markey, the lead detective had said, gesturing her toward the observation window before the interview began. We need your preliminary findings before we go in. Anything that confirms cause of death, time of death, identity. She had given her report with the flat, professional cadence she used for every case, unaware that in 6 weeks she would look back on this exact moment as the last one in her life untouched by him. Before she knew his voice, his hands, the particular quiet ferocity with which he loved the few people he allowed close. Right now, he was only a name in a file.
Cesare Vitali, 38, heir apparent to the Vitali family's shipping and import operations, prime suspect in the murder of Elena Conti, last known romantic and business associate of the deceased. She had walked into that interrogation room expecting a monster and found instead a man who watched her enter with an attention so total it had almost physically stopped her mid-stride. Dr. Markey, he'd said, before either lawyer could speak. I understand you're the one who'll be determining exactly how Elena Conti died. That's correct? Then I'd like you to know, for the record and off it, that I had nothing to do with her death, and that I intend to prove that in whatever way your evidence allows, because I have no interest in a legal technicality saving me from a truth I didn't commit. His eyes had held hers, unblinking, utterly certain. I understand you have no reason to believe me. I only ask that you look at everything, not simply what's presented to you as convenient. It had been, she would realize much later, the first thread of the request that eventually led her to the penthouse, to the folder, to a farmhouse in the hills, and a woman who wasn't dead. But in that moment, sitting across from a man the entire department believed capable of ordering 3 deaths without losing sleep, she had simply felt the strange, unprofessional prickle of being looked at by someone who seemed to be seeing past the badge and the clipboard to something underneath that she hadn't examined herself in years. I look at everything, she'd said. That's the only promise I make in this job. Good, he'd said. That's all I'm asking for. The interview had continued for another 40 minutes. Questions about his whereabouts, his relationship with the victim, the shipping contracts that formed the backbone of the prosecution's motive theory, and Teodora had watched from behind the glass, taking notes, telling herself the tightening in her chest was simply professional intrigue at an unusually self-possessed suspect. She had gone home that night,
and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, found herself unable to stop thinking about a case before the physical evidence had even finished processing. Not the murder, not the timeline. Him. The strange, unsettling stillness of a man who seemed entirely unbothered by an accusation that would have reduced most people to panic, and the single sentence that had stayed lodged in her chest for the rest of the night, replaying itself with an insistence she didn't yet understand. I only ask that you look at everything, not simply what's presented to you as convenient. She hadn't known, that first night, that he was asking her to save his life. She had only known that something about the request, earnest, direct, entirely unlike the practiced denials she usually heard from suspects, had lodged itself somewhere she couldn't easily dig it back out of. It would be the last uncomplicated night's sleep she got for the next 2 months. She had noted, in her private observations that first night, the kind of unofficial impression she never wrote into a formal report, that he did not fidget the way most suspects did not perform outrage or wounded innocence, did not perform anything at all. He simply answered every question with a directness that struck her as strange for a man his lawyers clearly wished would say less. When the detective had asked whether he'd loved Elena Conti, he had answered without hesitation, "No. I respected her. I would never have hurt her, and I intend to find out who did, regardless of what this investigation concludes." It was, she would think later, the first true thing he had ever said to her, long before either of them understood how many more true things would eventually pass between them. 9 weeks before the arrest, the murder that never was. The call came in at 3:47 a.m., and Theodora would remember the exact time for the rest of her life, because it was the moment the entire architecture of her carefully ordered existence had begun, without her knowledge, to shift. "Fire at a warehouse near the docks," the dispatcher said. "1 body recovered. Detectives are requesting forensic pathology on scene before the remains are moved." She had driven to the scene half asleep, coffee scalding her tongue, running through the mental checklist she ran through every time. Preserve the scene, document before disturbing anything, resist every urge to draw conclusions before the evidence justified them. She had been doing this work for 14 years. She knew, walking toward the scorched frame of the warehouse under floodlights and the low murmur of uniformed officers, exactly how a scene like this one usually unfolded. This one had unfolded exactly as designed, which was, in retrospect, the first thing that should have bothered her. The body was severely burned, positioned in a way that suggested, to the detectives already forming a narrative before she'd even opened her kit, that the victim had been unable to escape the fire. A handbag nearby, only partially damaged, contained a driver's license identifying the victim as Elena Conti, 29, a name that meant nothing to Theodora yet, but would come to define the next 2 months of her life. Dental records, requested and delivered with unusual speed from a private clinic, showed a match convincing enough that no one on scene questioned it. "Cause of death?" the lead detective had asked, notebook ready. "I won't have a preliminary determination until the body's on my table," Theodora had said, the answer she gave every time someone tried to rush her toward a conclusion before the science supported it. "But smoke inhalation is consistent with the visible damage. I'll know more after toxicology." It was the toxicology that had returned the first inconsistency 3 days later, a compound in the blood panel that shouldn't have been there if the victim had simply died in a fire, a substance whose presence suggested she had already been unconscious, possibly already dying, before the flames ever reached her. Theodora remembered the particular quiet satisfaction of catching that detail, the specific professional pride of a pathologist who refused to accept smoke inhalation as an easy answer when the chemistry told a more complicated story.
She hadn't known, writing that report, that she was walking directly into the centre of a trap built with her own reputation for thoroughness in mind. Whoever had engineered this, and she would not learn the full extent of Dario Vitale's involvement for another 6 weeks, had understood with unsettling precision exactly how a pathologist as careful as Theodora would respond to a body left slightly, deliberately imperfect. A story too clean would have invited scrutiny. A story with one carefully placed inconsistency pointing directly toward a specific and traceable poison was far more dangerous, because it gave her exactly enough to build a case and exactly enough rope for Cesare Vitale to hang himself with. The toxicology report named a compound sourced according to a supplier database Theodora cross-referenced 2 days later, exclusively through shipping contracts controlled by the Vitale family's import business. It was the kind of detail that closed a case. Clean, specific, traceable, damning. It was also, she would learn many weeks later, entirely fabricated. The compound planted in a blood sample that had never belonged to Elena Conti at all, drawn instead from a nameless woman who had died 3 states away and whose body had been transported under cover of a legitimate coroner transfer, specifically to be burned in that warehouse, and discovered exactly the way Theodora had discovered it. She hadn't known any of that on the night she stood in the ash and floodlights, documenting a scene she believed, with the full confidence of 14 years of training, told a straightforward story about a young woman who had died horribly at the hands of a man with the resources and motive to arrange it. She had gone home that morning, showered off the smell of smoke, and written the first line of a report that would eventually put an innocent man's name on trial for a murder that had never happened. She had been good at her job that night. That was the part that would haunt her most later. That every single professional instinct she trusted, every piece of careful, rigorous methodology she had built her entire career on, had been turned, without her knowledge, into a weapon aimed at a man she hadn't even met yet. 3 months before the arrest, Theodora's ordinary life. If anyone had asked Theodora Marchi 3 months before the Elena Conti case landed on her desk whether she was happy, she would have said yes without hesitation, and she would have meant it. And it would have taken her considerably longer than she'd like to admit to notice that happy and occupied had quietly become the same word in her private vocabulary. Her days ran on a schedule so precise her colleagues joked they could set their watches by it. 7 a.m., the morgue, coffee black and too hot. Case reviews until noon. Autopsies through the afternoon, conducted with the particular hum of old ballads under her breath that her mentor, Dr. Fablizi, had taught her to use as a private ritual. A way of honouring the dead with something gentler than clinical silence. Evenings, when she wasn't on call, spent alone in an apartment with too many books and a single houseplant she'd somehow kept alive for 6 years through sheer force of will. As though proving to herself she was capable of tending something, even when she rarely let anything close enough to need tending. Her mother called every Sunday at 11, and every Sunday asked the same gently hopeful question.
And every Sunday, Theodora gave the same practiced deflection, delivered with enough warmth that her mother couldn't quite call it evasive, though it was.
"I worry about you, cara," her mother had said the Sunday before the Conti case began. "All that death, every day. It can't be good for a person's heart, spending so much time with the dead and so little with the living." "The dead don't lie to me, Mamma. That's more than I can say for most of the living." It had been a joke, mostly, but there was a truth buried in it that Theodora had never examined too closely, that somewhere in the years since her divorce, 6 years earlier, from a man who had found her dedication to her work a convenient excuse for his own infidelity, she had quietly, deliberately built a life that required very little from anyone and offered, in turn, very little vulnerability in return. She had told herself it was discipline, focus, the natural consequence of a demanding career that didn't leave room for anything else. She had not, until Cesare Vitale sat across an interrogation table and looked at her like she was the only interesting thing in a room full of lawyers, understood how thoroughly she had mistaken solitude for peace.
Her colleagues at the coroner's office respected her, admired her even, but kept a certain careful distance that she had never questioned until she found herself missing it, weeks later, when Cesare's attention made her realize how rarely anyone looked at her and saw a whole person, rather than a set of exceptional professional qualities. Her ex-husband had called her married to the job in the final bitter months of their divorce, and she had accepted the label the way she accepted most criticism, filed it away, examined it for useful truth, and moved forward without letting it slow her down. She had believed, genuinely and without much self-pity, that this was simply who she was. A woman whose deepest intimacy was reserved for the truth, extracted patiently from bodies that could no longer speak for themselves. A woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that love was a risk she had already taken and lost, and that the version of her life built around discipline and purpose was not a consolation prize, but an actual sufficient home. She would think back on this version of herself often in the months after everything changed. Not with contempt, exactly, but with a kind of tender disbelief. The way you might look at an old photograph of yourself and marvel at how certain you'd once been about things you hadn't yet been tested on. She had no idea, 3 months before the Conti case, that a man was about to walk into her professional life who would take every careful wall she'd built and, without ever raising his voice or making a single demand, simply refuse to accept that any of them were load-bearing. She had, in truth, tried dating twice in the years since her divorce, both times with men who seemed, on paper, perfectly reasonable choices, and both times she had found herself relieved rather than disappointed when the arrangements quietly dissolved after a handful of dinners. She had told herself this was simply pickiness, the natural consequence of having high standards, forged by years of demanding, exacting work. It had not occurred to her, until much later, that the real explanation might be simpler and far less flattering, that she had grown so accustomed to controlling every variable in her life that the prospect of genuine intimacy, messy, unpredictable, entirely outside her ability to manage, had come to feel less like an opportunity and more like a risk she'd already decided, quietly and without ever saying so, wasn't worth taking. 2 years before the arrest, Cesare's rise. To understand what Cesare Vitale had become by the time he sat across an interrogation table from a forensic pathologist who would eventually save his life, it was necessary to understand what he had survived to get there. His father, Massimo Vitale, had died 2 years earlier, officially of a heart attack, unofficially, as everyone within the family's inner circle understood, without ever saying aloud, of a slow poisoning that no one had ever been able to prove, and that Cesare had spent every day since suspecting, without evidence, had originated with his own uncle. Massimo's death had thrown the family into the particular chaos that afflicts empires built on personal loyalty rather than formal succession, a power vacuum that Dario, as the eldest surviving brother, had immediately moved to fill, positioning himself as regent for a transition period he had no genuine intention of ever ending. Cesare had been 36 when his father died, already the operational head of the family's shipping and logistics empire, already respected and feared by the lieutenants who ran the day-to-day machinery of a business that moved considerably more than legitimate cargo through its ports. He had not wanted the full weight of leadership thrust onto him in the middle of grief. He had taken it anyway, because the alternative was watching Dario consolidate power through channels that would have gutted every partial reform Cesare's father had spent the last decade of his life quietly trying to implement. Reforms meant to move the family's interests further from the violence that had defined his own father's generation, and further towards something that could, eventually, survive contact with legitimate scrutiny. Dario had never forgiven him for it. "You think you can run this family like a corporation," Dario had told him 6 months after Massimo's funeral, in a conversation Cesare remembered with total clarity, because it was the moment he understood, irreversibly, that his uncle considered him an obstacle rather than family. "Your father's sentimentality nearly cost us everything twice. I won't watch you finish the job." "My father kept us alive for 30 years without half the bloodshed your generation considered necessary," Cesare had said. "I intend to keep doing exactly that." "Then you'll be dead within 5 years, and I'll be the one cleaning up whatever mess your idealism leaves behind." He had not, at the time, understood how literally his uncle meant that threat. It would take 2 more years, an elaborate murder frame, and a pathologist with an unshakable commitment to uncomfortable truths for Cesare to fully grasp the extent of what Dario was prepared to do to reclaim the throne he believed was rightfully his own son Matteo's. A young man Dario had spent years grooming for a position his own limited talents and reputation for brutality had never been suited for. Cesare had spent those 2 years building walls instead of alliances, trusting almost no one outside a small circle of lieutenants whose loyalty predated his father's death, watching every meal for poison and every car for the particular stillness of an ambush, and slowly, methodically, becoming the cold, controlled, unreadable figure that the newspapers, and eventually the prosecution, would describe as evidence of a man capable of anything. He had not been capable of everything. He had been capable of exactly the amount of ruthlessness required to survive a war he had never wanted, waged by an uncle who had convinced himself that ambition and legacy were the same thing. He had built his entire adult identity around control, precisely because he understood, with total clarity, that a single moment of vulnerability in his position was an invitation for someone to end him. He had believed that, without exception, until the night a forensic pathologist looked at him across an interrogation table like she was trying to solve something more complicated than a murder. And something in him, something he had spent 2 years carefully starving into silence, had recognized, with a kind of terrified relief, exactly how badly he wanted to be truly seen by someone who wasn't measuring him for a coffin or a throne.
There had been a brief window, in the first months after his father's funeral, when Cesare had considered walking away from the family entirely, taking the modest inheritance his mother had left him separately, disappearing into a legitimate life somewhere his name meant nothing. He had gone so far as to research universities abroad, cities where no one would recognize the Vitale name, a life built around anonymity rather than power. It was Massimo's oldest lieutenant, a weathered man named Ferro, who had served 3 generations of the family, who had talked him out of it. "Your father spent 30 years trying to drag this family somewhere better," Ferro had told him. "If you leave now, Dario undoes every inch of that progress in a year, and a lot of people who trusted your father to protect them will pay for it. You don't have to want this life, Cesare. You just have to be willing to carry it a little longer than you'd like, for the people who don't have anywhere else to go." Cesare had stayed. He had never fully forgiven himself for how close he'd come to leaving. 3 years before the arrest, the succession battle begins, Dario Vitale had spent 30 years believing he was owed something the world had never quite given him. And by the time his brother Massimo lay dying in a hospital bed, neither of them acknowledged was the result of anything but natural causes. That belief had calcified into something closer to religious conviction. He had been the elder brother. He had, by every tradition the family claimed to honour, the stronger claim to leadership when their own father had stepped down 20 years earlier, and he had watched, with a bitterness he'd spent 2 decades learning to hide behind warmth and charm, as the family council chose Massimo instead, citing a temperament better suited to the increasingly complicated work of running an empire that needed more each year to resemble a legitimate business, rather than the brutal enterprise their grandfather had built it as. "You have your father's talent for violence," the council's decision had effectively told him, "but not his son's talent for restraint." Dario had smiled through that verdict, the way he smiled through everything, and had spent the following 20 years building, in the shadow of his younger brother's leadership, a network of loyalty and leverage specifically designed to ensure that when the opportunity finally came, no council decision would be able to stop him from taking what he had always believed was his. Massimo's death had been, for Dario, less a tragedy than a long-awaited unlocking. He had positioned himself as regent with practiced, grieving reluctance, the perfect performance of a man doing his duty rather than seizing an opportunity. What he had not anticipated was Cesare, his brother's son, only 36, inheriting not just a title, but a genuine loyalty from the family's operational lieutenants that Dario, for all his charm, had never quite managed to cultivate for himself. "He's soft," Dario had told his own son Matteo in the months following Massimo's funeral. "He wants to turn this family into something his father would be proud of, some legitimate business empire that pays its taxes and answers to lawyers instead of loyalty. He'll bankrupt us with his idealism, or he'll get us all arrested trying to prove he's better than the rest of us. Either way, he cannot be allowed to finish consolidating power." Matteo, 29, and hungry in the specific, dangerous way of a young man who has been told his whole life he deserves more than he's been given, had needed very little convincing. Together, father and son had spent the following year quietly rebuilding the network of loyalty Dario had failed to secure for himself 20 years earlier, offering favours to lieutenants who felt overlooked by Cesare's more cautious, more legally conscious approach to the business, planting doubts about his judgment, his readiness,
his fitness to lead a family that had survived for 3 generations by being willing to do what legitimate businesses could not. It had not been enough. Cesare's leadership, cautious as it was, had proven effective. The family's legitimate holdings growing, its exposure to law enforcement scrutiny shrinking, its lieutenants increasingly convinced that the future Cesare offered was more sustainable than the one his uncle promised. By the time Dario understood that he could not simply outmaneuver his nephew through patience and politics, 2 years had passed, and his window for a clean transition of power had narrowed to something considerably more desperate. "We need something permanent," Dario had told Matteo the night the two of them first discussed what would eventually become the Elena Conti case. "Something that removes him, legally, publicly, in a way that makes it impossible for the council or the lieutenants to rally behind him afterward. A murder charge does what an assassination attempt can't. It doesn't make him a martyr, it makes him a liability." It had taken another 8 months to find Elena, a woman on the periphery of the family's business dealings, vulnerable enough, in debt deep enough, to be persuaded that disappearing with a substantial payment was preferable to whatever consequences awaited her for the embezzlement Dario himself had orchestrated and then threatened to expose. It had taken another 4 months to source a body that could pass, under controlled circumstances, for hers. It had taken a final 6 weeks of careful planning to ensure the evidence pointed, with just enough plausible specificity, toward Cesare. Dario had believed, watching the case unfold exactly as designed, that he had accounted for every variable. He had not accounted for a forensic pathologist stubborn enough to question a story that everyone else in the department had accepted without a second look. And he had certainly not accounted for the possibility that his nephew, a man he had always considered too controlled to be vulnerable to anything, might fall so completely and so quickly for the one person capable of unravelling everything he had built. 2.5 years before the arrest, Massimo's death. Massimo Vitale had known, in the final weeks of his life, that he was being poisoned. He had never said as much to anyone, not even to Cesare, because he understood, with the particular clear-eyed pragmatism that had let him lead the family successfully for 2 decades, that an accusation without proof would simply hand Dario the exact chaos he was hoping for. Better, Massimo had decided, to let his own death look natural and trust that his son would be sharp enough, eventually, to see what he himself had not been able to prove in time. He had spent his final lucid weeks not seeking revenge, but preparing his son for the war he knew was coming. He had transferred key accounts into structures only Cesare could access. He had personally called in decades-old favours from lieutenants whose loyalty predated Dario's ambitions, securing quiet promises of support for whatever came after his death. He had, in the last conversation the two of them ever had, Cesare sitting at his father's bedside in a private hospital room secured by men Massimo trusted with his life, which was, by then, a very short list, given his son the only advice he had left to give. "Don't become him," Massimo had said, his voice thin with the effort of speaking at all. "Your uncle believes strength means being willing to do anything. That's not strength, Cesare. That's just fear wearing a more expensive suit. Real strength is holding on to whatever's left of your humanity, even when everyone around you insists it's a weakness." Your mother understood that. I only understood it because she taught me, and I have spent every year since she died trying to be the man she believed I could become. I don't know if I can lead this family the way you did, Papa. You won't lead it the way I did, Massimo had said, something that might have been a smile ghosting across his grey, exhausted face. You'll lead it your own way, and it will terrify you, and you'll make mistakes I never made and avoid mistakes I did. That's not failure, figlio mio. That's simply what it means to actually be your own man, instead of a copy of your father. His hand, thin and trembling, had found Cesare's. The only thing I ask is that you don't let this family turn you into someone incapable of loving anything that isn't useful to you. That is the real inheritance your uncle is trying to steal, not the business, not the money. Your capacity to still be human underneath all of it. Don't let him win that particular war, even if you lose every other one. Massimo had died 4 days later. The official cause of death, signed off by a coroner whose relationship with Dario Vitale would not come to light until Teodora's investigation 18 months later, was listed as cardiac arrest resulting from complications of a long undisclosed heart condition. Cesare had never believed it, not for a single day. Though it would take him 2 years and an entirely different pathologist, one who refused, on principle, to accept a convenient explanation without independently verifying it, to finally understand exactly how his father had died, and exactly who was responsible. He had walked out of that hospital room a different man than he'd walked in. Not colder, not yet. That transformation would take another 2 years of siege, betrayal, and increasingly desperate manoeuvring from his uncle to fully complete. But something in him had hardened that day into a specific, unbending resolve. He would honour his father's final request, would hold on to whatever humanity he could salvage, even while building the fortress of control necessary to survive what was coming. He had believed for 2 years that keeping that promise meant keeping everyone at arm's length, that love, in his world, was simply another vulnerability waiting to be exploited by a man who had already proven he was willing to poison his own brother to seize power. He would not understand until a stubborn, brilliant pathologist refused to accept his guilt without seeing every piece of evidence herself that his father had never meant for him to stop loving anyone. He had only meant for him to be careful about who he let close enough to matter. In the weeks after his father's funeral, Cesare had gone, alone and without any of his usual security, to the small cemetery outside the city, where both his parents were buried side by side. He had stood there for over an hour, saying nothing, until finally he had knelt at his mother's headstone, dead now 28 years, a woman he barely remembered, except in fragments of scent and sound, and made a promise he would spend the following 2 years trying, and frequently failing, to keep. "I'll take care of him," he'd said, meaning his father, already gone, already beyond needing anyone's care, but the words had felt necessary anyway, a way of anchoring himself to something softer than the war he could already feel gathering on the horizon. "And I won't let what's coming turn me into someone you wouldn't recognize." It was a promise made to 2 dead parents by a son who had no idea, kneeling in that quiet cemetery, exactly how close he would come to breaking it before a stubborn pathologist reminded him it wasn't too late to keep. 15 years before the arrest, young Cesare had been 23 the first time his father asked him to be present for something he would spend the rest of his life trying not to remember in detail. A lieutenant named Bruno had been skimming from the family's shipping revenues for over a year, a betrayal that, in the world Cesare had been born into, could not simply be forgiven or quietly corrected. Massimo had brought his son along not because he wanted Cesare to participate, but because he had understood, with the particular grim wisdom of a man who had inherited this life rather than choosing it, that shielding his son from the reality of what the family's power actually required would only leave him unprepared for the day he inherited it himself. "You don't have to enjoy this," Massimo had told him quietly in the car on the way to the meeting that would end Bruno's life. "God help you if you ever do, but you have to understand it completely, or you will never be able to lead people who live and die by these rules. Understanding is not the same as becoming something monstrous, Cesare. Remember that, whatever happens tonight." He had remembered it. He had needed to remember it in the years that followed, as the specific violence required to maintain his family's position accumulated in the back of his mind like sediment, each incident settling a little deeper, a little heavier, until he sometimes wondered whether there would be anything left of the boy his mother had raised, once the weight, finally, became too much to carry. He had learned over those years to separate the two halves of himself with surgical precision, the version of Cesare who could authorize violence when the family's survival required it, and the version who still remembered, with an ache he never let anyone see, exactly how his mother's kitchen had smelled on Sunday mornings, exactly how her laugh had sounded when he'd successfully avoided burning the garlic for the first time. He had built an entire identity around keeping those two men separate, because he had watched what happened to lieutenants and rivals who let the violence bleed into everything else they were. Men who became, eventually, nothing but the worst thing they'd ever done, incapable of tenderness, incapable of trust, incapable of the specific vulnerability required to actually love another human being, rather than simply possess them. He had promised himself, at 23, standing in the aftermath of Bruno's punishment, with blood he hadn't personally spilled, staining the edge of his father's understanding of what leadership cost, that he would never let that second man consume the first one entirely. He would do what needed to be done. He would not become a person incapable of anything else. It had been, for over a decade, a promise he'd kept largely by avoidance, by never getting close enough to anyone outside his small circle of trusted lieutenants, that the question of tenderness versus violence ever needed to be tested. He had dated, occasionally, women who understood exactly what kind of arrangement they were entering into. Transactions dressed up as relationships, mutually beneficial and entirely devoid of the specific vulnerability he had promised himself, at 23, he would never let his position destroy. He had believed that was wisdom, self-preservation, the only sustainable way for a man in his position to survive without losing the last thread connecting him to the boy who had once stood on a kitchen chair learning what burnt garlic smelled like from a mother who wanted him to notice small mistakes before they became unforgivable ones. It had taken the forensic pathologist with steady hands and an unshakable commitment to inconvenient truths to show him, 15 years later, exactly how much of that wisdom had actually been fear, and exactly how much of himself he had been quietly starving in the name of a promise he had never fully understood the cost of keeping. There had been, in those early years, exactly one person Cesare had allowed to see both halves of himself without flinching. A cousin, Rosa, 3 years older, who had grown up alongside him in the family's periphery, before marrying outside the business entirely and building a quiet, ordinary life 200 miles away. She was the only person who still called him by the childhood nickname his mother had used, the only person who asked, genuinely, how he was doing, rather than how the business was doing. He visited her twice a year, always alone, always without any of the trappings of his position, and for a few hours at a time he let himself be simply Cesare, not the heir, not the boss, not the cold architect of an empire everyone else feared. He had told himself, driving home from those visits, that this was enough contact with his own humanity to keep the promise he'd made his father. It would take Teodora much later to show him exactly how insufficient a few stolen hours twice a year had actually been. 40 years before the arrest, the origin of the rivalry. Every war has an origin story, and the war between Cesare and his uncle had roots that reached back further than either of them had ever fully explained to Teodora. Back to a summer 40 years earlier, when their grandfather, Alessandro Vitale, had made a decision that would poison the family's succession for 2 generations. Alessandro had built the family's empire from almost nothing, a single dockside operation that had grown through a combination of ruthlessness and genuine business acumen into a shipping empire that touched 3 continents. He had 2 sons, Massimo, thoughtful and cautious, more interested in the legitimate business structures growing up around the family's traditional operations than in the violence that had built its foundation, and Dario, older by 4 years, sharper in some ways and crueler in others, a young man who had learned to love power for its own sake, rather than for anything it could build. Alessandro had loved them both, in his imperfect way, but he had trusted only one of them, and the summer Dario turned 30, his father had made that trust explicit in a decision that would define the rest of both brothers' lives. "You have your grandfather's temper," Alessandro had told Dario, in a conversation Dario had recounted to his own son decades later, with a bitterness that had never fully faded. "And my father built this family on temper, and temper eventually gets you killed, or gets everyone around you killed with you. Massimo has something neither of us ever had: patience, restraint, the wisdom to know which battles don't need to be fought at all. I am naming him my successor, not because I love you less, but because I want this family to survive past the next generation, and only one of you has shown me you understand what survival actually requires." Dario had smiled, accepted the decision with outward grace, and spent the next 4 decades ensuring that his father's assessment of him, brilliant but unrestrained, powerful but untrustworthy, would never again be allowed to cost him what he believed was rightfully his. He had watched his younger brother inherit not just the family's leadership, but their father's obvious pride, and something in him had calcified that summer into a bitterness so deep and so patient that it would take 40 years, 2 deaths, and an elaborate murder frame to finally, catastrophically, detonate. He had told himself over those decades a story in which he was the wronged party. The elder son passed over not for any genuine failing, but for his father's arbitrary sentimentality. A man who deserved, by right of birth and ability, exactly what had been denied him. It was a story convenient enough to justify almost anything, including, eventually, the slow poisoning of his own brother, and the elaborate frame job designed to remove his brother's son from a position Dario had spent 40 years believing should have been his. Cesare had not known, growing up, the full weight of this history. had understood only, in the vague way children understand adult tensions, that his uncle's warmth toward him had always carried an edge he couldn't quite name. It was only in the 2 years since his father's death, piecing together decades of resentment through half-finished conversations and his father's careful, coded journals, that Cesare had come to understand exactly how old this war truly was, and exactly how little chance there had ever been of resolving it through anything other than one of them eventually losing everything. He had inherited not just his father's business, but his father's war, a conflict that had been simmering since before Cesare was born, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to finally, violently, come to a head. Dario had told this story to Matteo so many times over the years that it had long since calcified into scripture rather than memory. The wronged elder son, the favoured younger brother, the father's arbitrary cruelty dressed up as wisdom. He never told his son the parts that complicated the narrative. That Alessandro had, in fact, offered Dario a genuine second chance, 3 years after naming Massimo his successor. A chance to prove his restraint by running the family's most delicate diplomatic relationships for a full year without incident. Dario had lasted 4 months before a rival's lieutenant ended up dead in a dispute that could easily have been resolved without bloodshed, confirming, in his father's eyes, exactly the temperament he'd been afraid of. Dario remembered that year only as further proof of his father's bias. He had never once, in 40 years, considered that his father's original assessment might simply have been correct. 52 years before the arrest, Alessandro and the woman who built the empire's conscience. If there was a single origin point for everything that would eventually happen, the succession war, the frame job, the trial, the improbable love story between a forensic pathologist and the man she was supposed to help convict, it was not a boardroom or a dockside warehouse. It was a small kitchen in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, 52 years before Teodora Marchi ever set foot in a courtroom, where a young woman named Concetta had looked at Alessandro Vitale, a dangerous, ambitious man 12 years her senior, and had made a decision that would shape 3 generations of his family without any of them ever fully understanding how much they owed her. Alessandro, by his own later admission, had been exactly the kind of man his grandson would one day become without meaning to. Cold by necessity, ruthless by circumstance, a man who had built an empire out of nothing through sheer force of will, and had, somewhere along the way, begun to wonder whether anything human still lived underneath all that ambition. He had met Concetta at her family's small restaurant, where she worked long hours and asked pointed, unimpressed questions about the increasingly notorious young man who kept returning, ostensibly for the food. "You think all this power makes you interesting," she had told him once, with the particular fearlessness of a woman who had never once been intimidated by his reputation. "It doesn't. It just makes you dangerous. Those aren't the same thing, and until you understand the difference, you'll never actually be worth loving, no matter how much money you make or how many men fear you." He had been furious, and then, 3 days later, he had come back, not with flowers or apologies, but with a genuine question, the first he had asked another human being in years without an ulterior motive attached. "Then tell me the difference. Teach me if you think you know it so well." She had spent the next 2 years doing exactly that, not softening him, because Concetta had understood, with wisdom well beyond her years, that a man in Alessandro's position could not survive by becoming soft. She had instead taught him the difference between strength that protected and strength that merely dominated, between fear that kept a family safe and fear that eventually consumed everyone who wielded it, including the man himself. She had married him not because she believed she could change what he did for a living, but because she had seen, underneath the danger, a capacity for genuine loyalty and love that she believed was worth the risk of building a life around. It was Concetta who had insisted, over Alessandro's initial resistance, that their sons be raised with at least one foot in a world outside the family's business. Music lessons, education, exposure to the kind of ordinary human tenderness that Alessandro himself had never been permitted as a child. It was Concetta's insistence on restraint and patience, passed down through Massimo, that had eventually shaped the entire philosophical divide between his approach to leadership and Dario's. A divide that had started, all those decades later, in her small, unimpressed refusal to be dazzled by a dangerous man's power. She had died when Massimo was only 12, too young to fully absorb everything she'd tried to teach both her husband and her sons, but not too young to remember, with total clarity, exactly what kind of man his mother had believed his father could become. Massimo had spent his entire adult life trying to live up to that memory. He had passed that same impossible, hopeful standard down to his own son on his deathbed, without ever fully knowing whether Cesare would find someone capable of teaching him the same lesson Concetta had once taught a much younger, much colder Alessandro Vitale. He had. It had simply taken 2 more generations, one elaborate betrayal, and a stubborn forensic pathologist unwilling to accept a convenient lie for the lesson to finally, fully take root. A woman who, without ever knowing the full history she was stepping into, walked into Cesare Vitale's dangerous, guarded life and asked him the exact same question his own grandmother had once asked his grandfather, 52 years and 3 generations before her. What's the difference between being feared and being worth loving? Cesare had spent 6 months and would spend the rest of his life trying to prove to Teodora that he had finally learned the answer. And somewhere, in a courtroom, 6 months after that first night in his penthouse, a jury was about to learn that the truth, the whole, unlikely, dangerous truth of how a doctor sworn to serve the dead had chosen instead to save a living man the world had already sentenced, was never really a story about a crime at all. It was a love story that had simply been forced by circumstance and betrayal to disguise itself as one.